From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The enemy, posing as a cameraman, detonated his explosives among a group of journalists in the area. As a result of the explosion, a number of our journalists and other people who were passerbys and nearby residents who were gathered at the scene were martyred and wounded.
In the deadliest day for Afghan journalists since the fall of the Taliban, 9 journalists are killed in a suicide bombing in Kabul. A 10th is shot dead in the eastern city of Khost. We'll speak with a reporter, as well as the head of Agence France-Presse in Paris. AFP's chief photographer in Kabul, Shah Marai, was killed in Monday's blast. Then a new monument to victims of white supremacy, slavery, and lynchings opens in Alabama.
We want to build this museum from enslavement to mass incarceration. We want people to understand there is this line from slavery to the racial bias and discrimination that we see today that needs to be understood. We want people to come through our museum and walk out with an opportunity to do something. We hope they'll be prepared to say something that sounds like never again should we tolerate racial bias and injustice in our country.
We'll speak to Brian Stevenson, the founder of Equal Justice Initiative, the group behind the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Afghanistan, the funerals have begun for the 10 journalists killed Monday, the deadliest day for journalists since the Afghan war began in 2001. 9 journalists died in a double suicide bombing attack in Kabul, including Agence France-Presse's celebrated photographer Shah Marai. Survivors of the bombing said the suicide bomber was posing as a cameraman. ISIS has claimed responsibility for the attack. A 10th journalist was shot dead Monday in the eastern city of Khost. We'll go to Kabul after headlines. For more on the attacks, that's after headlines. North and South Korea are continuing to take historic steps toward peace. On Monday, the South Korean military began to dismantle loudspeakers that have been blaring propaganda into the north since 2016. North Korea has announced it'll shift its clocks forward 30 minutes to align with South Korea's time zone. South Korean leader Moon Jae-in has also convinced North Korea's Kim Jong-un to hold the upcoming summit with President Trump at the demilitarized zone known as the DMZ. The diplomatic breakthroughs come after Friday's landmark summit between Kim and Moon, during which the two leaders pledged to denuclearize the peninsula and work to formally end the Korean War. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has accused Iran of lying about its efforts to build a nuclear weapon, only days before President Trump is slated to decide whether to pull the U.S. out of the landmark Iran nuclear deal. On Monday, Netanyahu unveiled what he claimed was a trove of stolen Iranian nuclear plans that he says prove Iran has violated the 2015 nuclear deal. Multiple experts and analysts immediately disputed Netanyahu's claims, saying he provided no evidence that Iran has violated the nuclear agreement. The International Atomic Energy Agency published a statement this morning saying it's found no credible indications of nuclear development in Iran after 2009. A spokesperson for Iran's foreign minister called Netanyahu an infamous liar and said his claims were ridiculous propaganda. On Monday night, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo refused to answer whether the Trump administration considered the documents evidence Iran has violated the nuclear deal. In California, 8 migrants who traveled to the U.S. border as part of a transnational caravan that has been repeatedly attacked by President Trump have been allowed to enter the United States to seek political asylum. The women and children walked through the San Ysidro port of entry only hours after Vice President Mike Pence arrived at the U.S. border and promised the migrants would be processed in line with U.S. immigration law. Over 100 more migrants from the caravan are still camped out on the Mexico side of the border. This is Kenya Elizabeth, the mother of 3 children from Honduras.
I decided to join the caravan because I didn't have another option. The people who are chasing after me found me in Tapachula. Staying in Mexico is not an option. I need to be helped. For Donald Trump to listen to me. I can't return to Honduras because I'll be killed together with my children. My children are an easy prey for the gangs, and I don't want that.
Immigration authorities also claimed Monday they arrested 11 members of the caravan for illegally entering the United States, although lawyers and organizers say the authorities have provided no evidence that those arrested were part of the caravan. Meanwhile, President Trump again railed against immigrants Monday.
We need a wall, number one. And you see that right now, you know, where they are, even though it's not a particularly good wall, and even though a small percentage can climb to the top, they have to be in extremely good shape. If they touch our country, essentially, you catch them and you release them into our country. That's not acceptable to anybody. So we need a change in the law.
Reuters has reported the Environmental Protection Agency has granted a financial hardship waiver to an Oklahoma oil refinery owned by billionaire former Trump advisor Carl Icahn. The waiver enables Icahn's refinery, CVR Energy, Inc., to save tens of millions of dollars by exempting it from the requirement of mixing biofuels into the gasoline. The regulation was enacted to cut air pollution and reduce petroleum imports. Icahn served as a special regulatory advisor to President Trump, during which time he personally vetted EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt for his job. Icahn resigned last August, just before the New Yorker magazine published an investigation detailing Icahn's potential conflicts of interest, including his heavy lobbying for the rule change about blending ethanol biofuels into gasoline, which is the exemption he's now received from the EPA for his refinery. The New York Times has obtained a list of 49 questions Special Counsel Robert Mueller is seeking to ask President Trump as part of Mueller's investigation of possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia during the 2016 election. The questions include whether Trump tried to protect former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn from prosecution and why Trump fired former FBI Director James Comey. Other questions entail Trump's discussions with his longtime personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, Trump's business dealings, and what Trump knew about a 2017 meeting in the Seychelles involving a Russian investor close to Putin and Blackwater founder Eric Prince, who also serves as an informal advisor to Trump during the transition. NBC is reporting White House Chief of Staff John Kelly has called President Trump an idiot multiple times since Trump took office, including once saying he doesn't even understand what DACA is. He's an idiot, unquote. General John Kelly has claimed the NBC report is, quote, total BS. Adult film star Stephanie Clifford, also known as Stormy Daniels, has filed a defamation lawsuit against President Trump after he attacked her on Twitter, insinuating she lied about the man who threatened her in 2011, telling her to leave Trump alone. Last month, after a sketch of the man was released, Trump tweeted a sketch years later about a non-existent man, a total con job playing the fake news media for fools, but they know it, he tweeted. Clifford says she had an affair with Trump in 2006, and she's also sued Trump to get out of a $130,000 non-disclosure agreement paid by Trump's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, only days before the 2016 election. Former Alabama Republican Senate candidate Roy Moore's lawyers have filed defamation lawsuits against 4 of the women who've accused Moore of sexually harassing or assaulting them when they were teenagers or young women. Among the women Moore has sued is Lee Kaufman, who says Moore forced himself on her when she was 14 years old and he 32. Another woman he sued, Tina Johnson, had her home burned to the ground earlier this year, only months after she came forward to publicly accuse Moore of groping her without her consent back in 1991. Moore lost last December's highly controversial special Senate election after at least 9 women, including Kaufman and Johnson, came forward to accuse him of sexual harassment or assault. A growing number of women of color within the Time's Up movement are demanding the music and entertainment industries cut all ties with powerful singer and producer R. Kelly, after a number of women of color accused R. Kelly of rape and sexual assault in cases that stretch back decades. Among those demanding RCA Records, Spotify, Apple Music, and other companies cut ties with R. Kelly are television producer and writer Shonda Rhimes and award-winning director Ava DuVernay. And actress Ashley Judd has sued Harvey Weinstein, the Hollywood mogul who is now facing multiple criminal investigations after more than 100 women accused him of rape, sexual assault, or sexual harassment. Judd says Weinstein tried to sabotage her career after she rejected his sexual advances. In Arizona, a sea of 50,000 striking teachers dressed in red T-shirts rallied at the state capitol Monday to demand better funding for education And the teachers now say the strike will continue today on May Day, or International Workers' Day. Major mobilizations marking the workers' holiday have already begun across the world, with thousands of workers rallying across Asia, including in Indonesia, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea. More marches and actions are planned to take place across Europe, Africa, the Americas throughout the day. And in New York City, the anti-war activist, author, and professor Joel Covell has died at the age of 81. In the 1960s and 70s, Dr. Covell was a well-known psychiatrist who left the Albert Einstein Medical School out of his opposition to the corporate influence over medicine. He became a prolific writer and scholar who was also active in the movements against the Vietnam War and nuclear proliferation. He was the author of more than 10 books about systemic racism, ecology, and global warming. Joel Covell went on to run for the U.S. Senate in New York with the Green Party in 1998. He also ran for U.S. president against Ralph Nader in the Green Party primary in 2000. This is Professor Covell speaking on Democracy Now! In 2007 after his book Overcoming Zionism, Creating a Single Democratic State in Israel-Palestine was temporarily dropped by the University of Michigan after it caused a controversy.
And I feel that the notion of Zionism as that there is this kind of destiny of Jewish people to have their own state is just a wrong idea. And it's an idea that requires signing on to imperialism. It means signing on to ethnic cleansing. It means, despite everything that has been said about it, it means basically becoming a racist situation where you're oppressing an indigenous population and depriving them of their right to existence, and then thinking that somehow you can go ahead and have a decent life on that basis. Now, you can't, in my view, and I joined hands with those people who feel that the time has come to basically think of Israel in the same category as South Africa, as a state that just has gone wrong and needs replacement.
That's author, scholar, activist Dr. Joel Covell speaking on Democracy Now! He died Monday in New York City at the age of 81. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. 10 journalists died in Afghanistan on Monday, and the deadliest day for journalists since the Afghan war began in 2001. 9 journalists died in a double suicide bombing in Kabul. A 10th journalist was shot dead in the eastern city of Khost. The journalists in Kabul were directly targeted. They died while covering another bomb blast in the central district of the capital, which is home to NATO headquarters and a number of embassies. After journalists rushed to the scene of the first bomb blast, a suicide bomber dressed as a photographer blew himself up among the journalists. The suicide bomber, reportedly posing as a cameraman for the TV channel, a cameraman for the TV channel Zwandoon, described the scene of the twin bombings.
I was about 10 meters away from the site of the first explosion, trying to enter the site when the second blast happened. It was very powerful, and when I was finally at the site, I found many of my fellow reporters lying on the ground, some of them dead already.
ISIS claimed responsibility for the attack. The Committee to Protect Journalists condemned the attack. CPJ Stephen Butler said, quote, "This latest attack on journalists in Afghanistan is a reminder of the extreme dangers to media workers in that country and of the extremely brutal tactics used there by enemies of the free press." Among the victims was Agence France-Presse's celebrated photographer Shamarai. He's been working with AFP in Afghanistan for 2 decades, beginning as a driver for the agency under Taliban rule and working his way up to become AFP's chief photographer in Kabul. He's the father of 6 children, including a newborn daughter. The AFP global news director called Marai's death a devastating blow for the brave staff of our close-knit Kabul bureau and the entire agency. We're joined now by 2 guests. Ali Latifi is an Afghan-born journalist based in Kabul. He covered Monday's bombing for Think Progress. And in Paris, France, we're joined by Phil Chetwin, the global editor-in-chief for Agence France-Presse. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Ali Latifi in Kabul, I want to begin with you. Can you talk about what happened on Monday morning, yesterday morning?
Sure. So basically what happened was that the first attack allegedly tried to target the Afghan intelligence agency, which is also in the neighborhood where the attack took place. And what makes us think that it was targeted against journalists is that within about 20 minutes after the initial attack, a second bomber came claiming to have a camera with him, claiming to be a journalist, and he entered the site where the journalists were gathered and detonated his second bomb.
And talk about what happened next.
What happened next was basically what happens all the time. You know, people rushing to the scene, trying to get people taken care of. There would be ambulances trying to reach the scene. There would be people trying to take the dead and injured in taxis. And then as the hours went on, there was just shock because no one expected journalists to be outright targeted in this sort of a way. There have been attacks on television stations in the past, both by the Taliban and groups claiming to be Daesh or the so-called Islamic State, but there's never been something like this where they go to the exact site and deliberately target journalists posing as a journalist.
Tolo News compiled brief bios of each of the 10 journalists killed on Monday. Yar Mohammed Tolki was a cameraman at Tolo News, where he'd worked for 12 years. He was due to be married within the month. Shah Marai was AFP's chief photographer in their Kabul bureau. He leaves behind 6 children, including his newborn daughter. Ghazi Razuli was a journalist at One TV and a journalism student at Kabul University, 21 years old, scheduled to get married next month. Nawroz Ali Rajabi was a cameraman with One TV. He was the father of a 3-month-old baby. Farishta Mahram Durrani was a journalist for Azadi Radio. She was a producer of the Woman program on the station. Zabuun Kakar was a journalist for Azadi Radio. He's survived by his wife and child. Abdullah Hananzai was another journalist with Azadi Radio. He was the producer of the documentary The Poison Convoy, which covered issues related to drug cultivation and production in Afghanistan. Salim Talash was a journalist with Mashal TV. He got engaged last month. Ali Salimi had joined Mashal TV just a week ago. And then, in another city, in the eastern city of Khost, Ahmad Shah was shot dead on Monday. He worked for BBC Pashto. 10 journalists in one day. Phil Chetwynd is editor-in-chief at Agence France Presse. He's based in Paris, a national holiday today. We thank you for coming in. You have lost your star photographer in Kabul. Can you talk about him, talk about Shah Marai and what this means to you and who he was?
Well, thank you for having me, Amy. Marai was an extraordinary man in that really he started working for us as a driver under the time of the Taliban when it was extremely dangerous to really do any journalistic work at all. And he sort of cut his teeth really with a hidden camera in his hand, trying to smuggle out little bits and pieces of life under the Taliban, when really there was hardly any other journalists at all in Kabul. In fact, we had to pull everybody out at one point, and Marai was the only one who really held the fort for us until 9/11 happened, and we were able to re-establish our bureau properly with everybody in it. So he was very, very much the heart and soul of our Kabul bureau. He was a huge character, always a smiling character, always a very engaging character, always someone who would come in and sort of lighten the stress and bring a lighter moment to the bureau when he could see perhaps his younger and maybe more less experienced colleagues struggling a little bit in the current environment. So we really lost the pillar of our bureau in Kabul, and someone for us, and anyone who's been to Kabul, I've been many times to Kabul, and he was someone who you would always just remember as being absolutely the heart and soul of our team there.
Last year, Shah Marai wrote an essay about his and his family's life in Kabul. It was headlined, "When Hope is Gone." In it, he wrote, "Life seems to be even more difficult than under the Taliban because of the insecurity. I don't dare take my children for a walk. I have 5 and they spend their time cooped up inside the house. I've never felt life to have so little prospects, and I don't see a way out." Ali Latifi, if you could talk more about him, also your friend, Shah Marai, and that feeling as you work in Kabul as well.
Point out about someone like Shah Marai is that as the AFP said earlier, is that, you know, his is a common story. This is what has happened in Afghanistan. We have people who have started literally as drivers and translators and fixers and stringers who have worked their way up to the tops of their bureaus. And they're extremely dedicated, you know, determined to get the shot. And the one thing I always remember about the video and photojournalists at any scene like this in Kabul is, you know, you would see them hiding behind, like protecting themselves behind a wall with their cameras up in the air, desperate to get the shot, because that's their job, that's their duty, and they're very determined to get that. And so that's the one thing I will remember about all of these journalists, and I think that's the one thing we should all remember about all of them. In terms of what he said about life in Kabul, he's 100% correct. My own family, my own cousin doesn't like to take his children out on the street. My aunt, her husband recently passed away, and people said, why don't you go take a course? Why don't you go to a madrasa? Why don't you do this? And she said, how can I go out on that street? You know, she's like, the people aren't the same, the security situation isn't the same. I have no faith in what's going to go on. And to be quite honest, from 2016 to now, it hasn't gotten much better. In fact, it's probably gotten worse.
What does it mean to you? I mean, not just worse, we're talking about the worst attack on journalists in one day since 2001, since the beginning, since when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan.
I mean, it means that there's no more bars anymore, right? There's no more sort of barriers, right? If you can target journalists, then you can target anyone. And this is the thing that I found really surprising about the reaction to this, is people that I've known for years, people that were born and raised here, people that have been living here for years, the thing that shocked them more about this attack than anything was the fact that it was journalists. And I couldn't believe that people had that much of a connection to us as a, you know, as a group of people and as a profession. And I think, you know, I was asking people, why do you think that they would target journalists? And they said, basically, it says that there's nothing left. You know, no one is safe anymore. And that, I think, is really the scary part.
Bill Chetwynd, in addition to the 9 journalists who were lost, including Shah Mirai, your chief photographer in Kabul, you have another reporter who was just killed in Khost, who worked for BBC Pashto. What does this mean? I mean, you are the editor-in-chief at Agence France-Presse. Your organization signs people in this very difficult situation. Can you talk about the situation in Afghanistan?
Well, I think the situation in Afghanistan has been something that has been troubling us for a very long time. Really, over the last 10 years, as the situation has become worse and worse, and the Taliban attacks have become wider, and now we've seen the competition between the Taliban and Islamic State, almost the Islamic State group, almost to out-horror each other. The way we work and how to try to work safely has been something that has been weighing on us extremely heavily. We move our bureau several times. We change our procedures. We put in extra guidelines. We don't go to certain places. We're constantly looking and evolving and trying to work out how on earth we can do our jobs in this kind of environment. But of course, this latest attack really changes the game. As Ali has just said, to actually be in a situation where the journalists are actually lured into a trap and killed in this way, 9 or 10 in a single group, is really very shocking, and I think poses lots of questions about how we can try to report at all or safely in the future.
Bill Chetwynd, in 2014, your news agency, Agence France-Presse, lost journalist Sardar Ahmad, who was shot and killed along with his wife and 2 of his 3 children in a Taliban attack on an Afghan hotel. That was just 3 years ago. So you talk about how you do operate. So what will you do now? What will AFP do now without Shah Mirai?
Well, I think we have to firstly really understand fully the circumstances behind what happened and so on. Obviously, when you get an immediate attack like this, there are the first feelings as to what happened, the first reports and so on. But there is a need really to get to the bottom of exactly what happened before we can take any sort of radical decisions. But at the same time, it is our job to report around the world. We report on extremely dangerous things all around the world, and we find a way to do it. We've certainly done this in Syria for the last 5 years, which has been an extremely dangerous place to work. In the end, we ended up creating a little network of our own local journalist sources and so on around Syria on the ground, because after about 2013, it just became too dangerous for us to put our own people in after various kidnappings and murders and so on. So the Syrian situation is perhaps an example where when we were blocked one way from doing things, we are there to report the story. We are there. It's absolutely vital that the story of Afghanistan continues to be told. It's vital that the story of Syria continues to be told. And therefore, we have to find an asymmetric or a different way to tell the story if that is what is necessary.
Ali Latifi, you are in Kabul. You're a freelance journalist there. You face extreme danger all the time, as other journalists, as other civilians do. You've reported a lot on the thousands of Afghan refugees being deported from Turkey and the European Union because Afghanistan is, quote, safe now. Can you talk about what's happening?
So basically, yeah, this is exactly the problem. I was actually on a flight back from Dubai about a couple weeks ago, and when we were leaving the airplane, I heard the stewardess say, "Oh, no deportees on this flight." And I thought that was really interesting because it's, who are you deporting from Dubai? But the truth is that this is exactly the problem. You know, I've been to Turkey, I've been to Greece since 2013 covering the situation. And what we see is that, you know, these European Union governments, the Turkish government, in accordance with agreements with the Kabul government, are saying things like, oh, well, there are safe areas in Afghanistan. And the most common safe area that they claim is Kabul. Well, within 1 week, there have been 2 suicide bombings, or 3 actually, targeting civilians specifically, whether they be journalists or, you know, civilians as in like women, children, and men from the area. And so this is a major issue that no one is addressing. The fact that, you know, there are hundreds and hundreds of a lot of young men being deported back from the European Union, from Turkey, and who basically are coming back to an area where at any moment, you know, as Shomarai's journal said, and as other people have been saying, you really don't know when you step out of the house. You know, if you go one direction, there could be a bombing. If you go another direction, there could be a bombing. That area where the bombing took place on Monday, I go there. I go there to go to the Afghan Film Directorate. So, you know, had I gone 1 day later, I could have been there.
Phil Chetwin, as you report from Paris, based in Paris, you're editor-in-chief of AFP, can you talk about the effect of President Trump's comments about the press, calling it the enemy of the people?
Well, I think the interesting thing is it's not just President Trump. You're really having a wave of this kind of language coming from many countries around the world. The Philippines, Hungary, Slovenia, there's a sort of wave of attempts to decredibilize the work of working journalists around the world. And that's extremely concerning, because when you have an event such as we've just witnessed in Afghanistan, it should be an international scandal. We cannot allow for impunity against journalists and for such a grievous attack against people doing their job, people who are ultimately one of the pillars of a free society. So there's a general discourse around the world coming from certain countries and leaders, which is certainly eroding confidence and also trust in the work of very brave people on the front lines. And this latest incident in Kabul is just an example of the kind of risks people are taking all around the world, journalists working for many, many, many organizations to tell real stories, not to be involved in a game of fake news or involved in a game of misinformation, disinformation, and so on. There are people risking their lives every day to tell the stories that need to be told. And this attack really brings it home that it's beyond rhetoric. The reality is what we saw in Kabul. And so I think this whole thing that we've seen around the world in terms of this use of language, very negative language towards journalists, is an extremely negative thing and is having a very poor impact on our business.
And Ali Latifi, let me put that question to you on the ground in Kabul. You both live in Afghanistan, were born there. You've also lived in the United States. What it means to you that President Trump has called you, journalists, I mean, not you specifically, but journalists, the enemy of the people?
I think it's dangerous. You know, I've also lived in Turkey where there's a major issue with the free press. And I think it sort of creates this image of, I think that might have been why I was so surprised at how people reacted to the deaths of journalists here, because I've become so used to people saying, oh, fake news or the failing New York Times or whatever. And you see that, you know, it really has a value. You know, when you live in an informed population, news has a real value. But the one thing I wanted to address was the issue of impunity, right? So if we're talking about impunity for the Taliban and the so-called Daesh or so-called Islamic State forces, it's very hard to hold them accountable, obviously. But the other issue in terms of impunity is sort of the case in Khost and a week before in the southern province of Kandahar, where journalists are being killed by armed men. And no one is finding out what happened to them, who killed them. And there's no real justice for that. And we also have issues, you know, in terms of, again, saying how the press is treated. We also have a lot of issues with the police and with the military and with MPs and with warlords and with government-allied militias that have, you know, and with the intelligence agency that have taken journalists, put bags on their heads, taken them in the back of a car and thrown them in a basement asking them what they were doing. And this is another major issue. The Kabul government, you know, there's no way they can hold, like, let's be realistic, they can't hold these Daesh forces or the Taliban accountable, but they can hold their own security agencies and their own politicians accountable for how they treat journalists and for really, you know, sort of embracing that and learning that, you know, violence and intimidation, you know, it's not going to work and it's not going to help. And we're not the enemy. We're not there to take anyone down or to destroy anyone. And of course, this recent attack, that creates a problem for us because, again, you know, when people see a camera, and in a way, rightfully, they'll be suspicious. What's in that camera, right? Because for me, like, I'm a print journalist. A lot of times when I go to these kinds of things, the first thing they say to me is, where's your camera? That gives you credibility. That's an instant sort of marker that makes you recognized as a journalist. And now even that could be taken away from us. So I think it's very important that the issue of impunity is addressed all around.
And finally, Phil Chetwynd, editor-in-chief at Agence France-Presse, I wanted to switch gears for a moment because in the next days, President Trump will be deciding about whether to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal. The president of France, where you are, President Emmanuel Macron, just made a state visit to the United States to convince Trump not to pull out. But when he left, he said it looks like Trump will be pulling out. Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, just gave a major address with echoes of what General Powell did as Secretary of State in 2003 at the UN, saying the evidence is in, there's weapons of mass destruction, a speech that Powell would call a blot on his career later. And that's exactly what Netanyahu, in this speech that he gave in English to the world with big signs that said things like he lied, saying there's evidence is now in that Iran has lied. Your thoughts on what this means for President Trump, if in fact what Macron says is true?
Well, I think it has been something that has been signalled for a while from the White House that there could be this change of thinking on the Iran nuclear deal. The president's made it very clear from the beginning that he was not a fan, and there seemed to be a general belief that there were several key advisors around Trump, notably former National Security Advisor McMaster, who were holding the deal in check. I think we'd very much be into uncharted territory if we're to pull out of this, because it's clear also that the Europeans are still very, very much behind it, as was President Macron's visit to the United States showed. But I think this is something that we've been expecting. And I think what President Macron said as he left probably indicated the fact that this is not going to be a surprise.
I want to thank you both for being with us. Phil Chetwynd, editor-in-chief at Agence France-Presse, speaking to us from Paris, France. And Ali Latifi, freelance journalist based in Kabul, Afghanistan. Ali, stay safe. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll speak to Brian Stevenson, the founder of Equal Justice Initiative, the group behind the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, a new monument to victims of white supremacy, slavery, and lynchings, has just opened in Montgomery, Alabama.
We want to build this museum from enslavement to mass incarceration. And we want people to understand there is this line from slavery to the racial bias and discrimination that we see today that needs to be understood. We want people to come through our museum and walk out with an opportunity to do something. We hope they'll be prepared to say something that sounds like never again should we tolerate racial bias and injustice in our country.
Brian Stevenson live with us in Montgomery, Alabama in a minute.
گر کنم صاحب من بر تو نگاهی گاهی گر کنم صاحب من بر تو نگاهی گاهی عفو کن می شود از بنده
Afghan singer Mawash here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. On Thursday, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice opened in Montgomery, Alabama, a monument to victims of white supremacy in the United States. The memorial's centerpiece is a walkway with 800 weathered steel pillars overhead, each of them naming a U.S. county and the people who were lynched there by white mobs. This is a clip played during one of the opening events for the museum featuring the family members of lynching victims.
My great-grandfather, Thomas William Miles Sr., was lynched.
7 feet.
This man was taken and strangled to death. They also shot bullets in him.
Barren, strange fruit.
They stabbed him, beat him, tied him to the back of the buggy, and drug that around town.
Blood on the leaves.
His lynching was advertised in the Mississippi News. They dismembered parts of his body as souvenirs.
And blood at the roots.
One of them said, well, we gonna hang him. And so he made up the noose, and they put it around my neck.
Black bodies.
I remember.
Winging in the southern breeze.
There was no accountability. Families torn apart, communities torn apart, loss of businesses, loss of history. As a Black person, you don't expect justice.
In addition to the memorial dedicated to the victims of lynching, its partner site, the Legacy Museum from Enslavement to Mass Incarceration, also opened Thursday. The museum is located on the site of a former warehouse where enslaved Black people were imprisoned. It's midway between a historic slave market and the dock and train station where tens of thousands of enslaved people were trafficked during the height of the domestic slave trade. The museum and National Memorial for Peace and Justice are the culmination of years of exhaustive research and interviews with local historians and descendants of lynching victims conducted by the Equal Justice Initiative, led by its director, Brian Stevenson. In 2017, the Equal Justice Initiative issued the third edition of its Lynching in America report, which found that white Southerners lynched nearly 4,400 Black men, women, and children between 1877 and 1950. Nearly 800 of those lynchings were previously unaccounted for. The report details a 1916 attack in which a mob lynched Jeff Brown for accidentally bumping into a white girl as he ran to catch a train. In 1940, a crowd lynched Jesse Thornton for not addressing a white police officer as Mr. In many cases, the lynchings were attended by the entire white communities in an area. For more, we go to Alabama, where we're joined by Brian Stevenson, an attorney who's worked on death penalty cases in the Deep South since 1985, the founder, executive director of Equal Justice Initiative. Brian, welcome back to Democracy Now! Congratulations on this epic achievement, the museum and the monument. Talk about the years that have gone into developing this and why you pushed so hard for this in Montgomery, Alabama.
Well, thank you, Amy. It's great to be with you. I'm a product of Brown versus Board of Education. I grew up in a community where black children couldn't go to the public schools. There were actually no high schools for black kids when my dad was a teenager. And so when lawyers came into our community and made them open up the public schools, it planted a seed in my mind that the law can be a powerful tool for protecting disfavored people, marginalized communities. And I've kind of lived by that. I went to law school. I've been practicing law for over 30 years, and I'm still persuaded that the rule of law is critical to our capacity to create justice for those who are disempowered. But I've come to understand recently that even the law will be sufficient if we don't change the narrative, if we don't create a deeper commitment to equality. And I think even our courts have been compromised by this narrative of racial difference that we have in America, this history of racial inequality that has made us tolerant of bigotry and discrimination. So about 10 years ago, we began working on a project to change the narrative. We started doing this research on slavery, on lynching, on segregation. We put out these reports. We started putting up public markers, because this region is a region where the landscape is littered with the iconography of the Confederacy. People often say to me, why do you want to dig up the past? Why do you want to start talking about the past? We are preoccupied with the past in the American South. Last Monday was Confederate Memorial Day. It's a state holiday. We have a state holiday of Jefferson Davis's birthday. We don't have Martin Luther King Day in Alabama. We have Martin Luther King / Robert E. Lee Day. And this preoccupation with mid-19th century history is one of the characteristics that oppresses and burdens people of color. We talk about the mid-19th century, but we never talk about slavery. So for me, talking about slavery, talking about lynching, talking about segregation, talking about our history of racial inequality is critical to creating a consciousness that will allow us to move forward toward justice and equality. And I don't think we've done a very good job of that in our country.
Brian, I want to go to a clip from a short documentary that the Equal Justice Initiative produced last year, highlighting the story of one family whose ancestor was lynched.
My great-great-grandfather, Anthony Crawford, had an altercation at a store with a white storekeeper about the price of his cottonseed. Grandpa refused to do business with him and was arrested, and then was lynched in a spectacle, ritualistic killing at the town square in Abbeville, South Carolina, 100 years ago. A lot of people don't talk about the lynchings in their family, and some of us do. For those of us who do, we represent a whole slew of people who are so traumatized that they can't speak, that their relatives did not pass down this history to them. So the Crawfords have always felt, I think, an obligation to speak up for Grandpa Crawford. We were all socialized that way.
So did you add 15 minutes? That's Brian Stevenson, the documentary about this project that memorializes the victims of white supremacy, of slavery, of lynching. Brian, you've said that slavery didn't really end in 1865. You've talked about it just evolving from slavery to lynching to mass incarceration. Can you lay out that trajectory?
Sure. I do think that the great evil of American slavery was this narrative of racial difference. I mean, we have to understand that our nation has a very unhealthy narrative of racial difference that began at the very first moment when Europeans came to this continent. I mean, there were millions of Native people here. We are a post-genocide society because what I think we did to Native people was genocide. We killed them by the millions. We slaughtered them through famine and war and disease. We didn't own up to that because we said those Native people are different racially. And that narrative of racial difference is part of the reason why slavery flourished for so long. I really do believe the great evil of American slavery was this ideology of white supremacy, this myth we made up that black people aren't the same, they're not as evolved, they're not fully human, they're 3/5 human. And that consciousness, that bigotry, that ideology was, for me, the true evil of American slavery. And in 1865, when the Civil War was over and we passed the 13th Amendment, we committed to ending involuntary servitude and forced labor, but we didn't say anything about this narrative of racial difference, this ideology of white supremacy. And because of that, I don't think slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. It turned into decades of terrorism. And what happened to African Americans between Reconstruction, World War II, was racial terror. Black people were being pulled out of their homes, they were drowned, they were beaten, they were hanged, they were brutalized, sometimes on the courthouse lawn in front of thousands of white people who cheered and celebrated this ritualistic violence. And it had a powerful impact on communities of color. In fact, sometimes older people of color come up to me and they say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear somebody on TV talking about how we're dealing with domestic terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They said, we grew up with terror. We had to worry about being bombed and lynched and menaced every day of our lives. And 6 million people fled, black people fled the American South during the 20th century. And the black people in Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles and Oakland didn't go to those communities as immigrants. They went to those communities as refugees and exiles from terror. And we haven't talked about this history, this legacy. So in our memorial in Montgomery that opened last week, when you walk into the space, the first sculpture you see is a slavery sculpture. It's people in chains. It was made by West African artist Kwame Akoto Bamfo. He calls it Unchinchim, which is an African word for resistance and resiliency in the face of oppression. But it's important for people to understand that without slavery, without the legacy of slavery, without this ideology of white supremacy, black women and men would not have been lynched for bumping into a white person, for walking behind a woman, for knocking on the front door, for all of these social transgressions. It would not have happened. And I also think that this era is important for understanding how we got to where we are now. When you come out of our memorial that honors these 4,000 victims of racial terror lynchings, we have another sculpture created by Dana King. It's called Guided by Justice. It's 3 women walking during the Montgomery bus boycott. And one of the points we're trying to make is that we have not fully appreciated the courage of people like Claudette Colvin, Mary Louise Smith, Rosa Parks, in resisting segregation. They could have lost their lives, and that courage has to be understood. And then, of course, the 4th sculpture is by Hank Willis Thomas, and it's a collection of men with their arms raised up, which speaks to this present moment where this ideology of white supremacy, this narrative of racial difference persists. And today we still live in a country where black and brown people are frequently presumed dangerous and guilty just because of their color. And whether they're sitting in a Starbucks or they're in a courtroom or they're confronting a police officer, that burden still exists. And we're not going to lift that burden until we tell this history, this story, and motivate people to deal with this issue much more directly.
Bryan Stevenson, we're going to have our second break be Common, the rap that he did on Friday night at the concert, Equal Justice Initiative's Concert for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama.
The caged bird sings for freedom to ring. Black bodies being lost in the American dream. Blood of black being, a pastoral scene. Slavery still alive, check Amendment 13. Now whips and chains are subliminal. Instead of nigga, they use the word criminal. Sweet land of liberty, incarcerated country. Shot me with your ray gun and now you wanna trump me. Prison is a business, America's the company. Invested in injustice, fear, and long suffering. We staring in the face of hate again. The same hate they say will make America great again. No consolation prize for the dehumanized. For America to rise, it's a matter of black lives. We gon' free them so we can free us. America's moment to come to Jesus. Come on.
That's Letter to the Free by Common, performed Friday night at Equal Justice Initiative's Concert for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we continue with rapper, activist, actor Common, who performed that night. Between songs, he addressed the audience.
Like a lot of people from Chicago, my family migrated. My family migrated from the Deep South from several generations ago. And yes, they were seeking jobs and education, but they also were fleeing racial terror. They were fleeing terrorists in the South, racial terrorists. Now, some of my ancestors migrated and some stayed, but we've all learned that these decades later, there's really no running from our collective history. This history is our American history, and it's time for us to acknowledge it, no matter what color you are, black, white, Latino, Asian, Native American. It's time for us to acknowledge it. And we'd like to live in a reality where our country is growing, and it's growing where freedom and dignity are in fact inalienable rights. And this can't happen without a real reckoning of our history. That means it's time for the government, it's time for everybody working as politicians to acknowledge this history. It's some pain and healing that needs to happen. And we have to know that this history, and when we talk about this history, we will heal.
That's Common speaking on Friday night at the opening of the monument and the museum to the victims of slavery, white supremacy, lynching. I want to turn to filmmaker Ava DuVernay, who was also there at the opening of the Legacy Museum.
Free, dedicated artists reveal a singularly important thing, that racism was and is not only a public mark of ignorance, it was and is a monumental fraud. Racism was never the issue. Profit and money always was. The threat was always jobs, land, or money. When you really want to take away, to oppress, to prevent, you have to have a reason for despising your victim. Racism was always a con game that sucked all the strength from the victim. It's the red flag that's danced before the head of a bull. Its purpose is only to distract, to keep the bull's mind away from his power and his energy, to keep it focused on anything but his own business. Its hope for consequence is to define Black people as a reaction to white presence, as opposed to being in harmony with it.
That's Ava DuVernay speaking at the opening of the Legacy Museum. Brian Stevenson, you have done something quite remarkable as the discussion around the country, and I want to get your comment on this, the taking down of monuments to racism, Confederate generals and others. You have erected new monuments here. You have erected the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in the Legacy Museum. Talk about that.
Well, I think that we just haven't done a very good job of creating a consciousness about this history. You know, when I go to South Africa, when I go to the Apartheid Museum, I see a place that is a very powerful institution designed to make sure no one ever forgets the hardship of apartheid. The suffering of Black Africans by that white minority is documented and detailed. They make it impossible for people to forget or to distort that history. In Rwanda, the Genocide Museum there is a powerful cultural institution. They actually have human skulls in that space. That's how desperately the survivors and victims of that horror want to express their grief. When I go to Berlin, Germany, I see markers and stones every 100 meters outside the homes of Jewish families, Roma families that were abducted during the Holocaust. Germans want you to go to the Holocaust Memorial, and they want to change the narrative. They don't want to be thought of as Nazis and fascists for the rest of their lives. But in this country, we don't talk about slavery. We don't talk about lynching. We don't talk about the horrors of this history of racial inequality. Many of the people who were with us last week came up to me and said, you know, I just realized I've never seen a sculpture about slavery before in my life. They'd never really been in a place where they were confronted with the legacy of lynching in a way that was tangible and visible. And I think that implicates our ability to move forward, to create real equality. And so, yes, it is important that we create a new landscape, that we erect symbols and statues and monuments and markers that push our nation in a different direction, rather than protecting these false narratives that I think we have built to reinforce that same ideology of white supremacy. And I think our artists, our sculptors, our writers, our musicians have a critical role to play in what I see as essentially narrative work. I don't think we've ever felt the kind of shame we should feel about what we did to Native Americans, about what we did during slavery, about what we did during lynching, what we did during segregation. And I don't think of shame as a bad thing for us to experience. When you do something shameful, there has to be some moment of remorse and regret and repentance and truth-telling. That's what leads to redemption and recovery and repair and restoration. I represent people who do bad things. None of them expects to be paroled if they're not willing to admit the wrongfulness of their crime. And a lot of times when people hear me talking about this, I think they get a little edgy because we've become such a punitive society, Amy. I think, we have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We're so punitive in America that we're unwilling sometimes to admit our mistakes, to acknowledge our wrongdoings because we fear punishment. And for me, what's been important about this project is to make clear to people, I'm not interested in talking about our history because I want to punish America. I think talking about our history is the way we liberate America, the way we move to a different place. We get to some place where we acknowledge the pain of this path so we can recover. I do believe that our country needs truth and repair, truth and reconciliation, but I believe those things are sequential. You can't get the repair, you can't get the reconciliation until you first tell the truth.
Brian, I wanted to ask you about what happened at the Montgomery Advertiser as your monument and museum was going up. Last week, the editorial board of the local paper, the Montgomery Advertiser, published a public apology for its previous coverage of lynching on the same day as the monument and museum opened. In the editorial, the board wrote, quote, "We take responsibility for our proliferation of a false narrative regarding the treatment of African Americans in those disgraceful days. We've propagated a worldview rooted in racism and the sickening myth of racial superiority. We must never be as wrong as this again," unquote. The Montgomery Advertiser was among many white-owned newspapers across the United States that failed to investigate and at times even celebrated the white mob violence that killed thousands of African Americans throughout U.S. history. Instead, it was black journalists, most notably Ida B. Wells, who exposed the horrors of lynching to the world and paid a heavy price for that. As we wrap up in this last 30 seconds, Brian Stevenson, can you talk about the significance of your paper doing this?
Well, I'm very encouraged by that. I mean, that's precisely the kind of reaction I hope we see across this country. White media, white journalists, white newspapers were complicit. They were aiders and abettors in much of this violence. They sometimes advertised where these lynchings would take place. And so to acknowledge that, to repent for that, to commit to not do that again is the very heart what I think our nation needs to do in response to this legacy and this history. So I'm encouraged by that. I hope other newspapers across the region do the same thing.
Well, we're going to do part 2 of this conversation and post it as a web exclusive at DemocracyNow.org. Our guest, Brian Stevenson, founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, the nonprofit behind the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, the country's first ever memorial to the victims of lynching in the United States. Brian is the author of Just Mercy, a story of justice and redemption. Democracy Now! Has job openings, year-long paid fellowship for social media, as well as video production. Go to our website, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.